I opened the door and saw them. The HOA stood on my porch, stone-faced, holding a $10,000 fine. Tear down the fence or regret it. The neighbors stayed silent, too used to being afraid, but I just smirked and pulled out my lawsuit. What happened next changed everything. Michael Hudson stepped onto the porch of his new home and took a deep breath of the crisp morning air. Finally, peace. His entire life had been spent in the thick of it. Courtroom battles, high-profile cases, clashes with criminals, corporate sharks, and power-hungry politicians. But that was all behind him now. Before him stretched the perfect suburban landscape, manicured lawns, symmetrical pastel-colored houses, and the occasional car rolling lazily down the street. His new home, a spacious red brick mansion with white columns, was the embodiment of the American dream, a place where he could finally escape the bureaucracy, the courtrooms, and the endless fight for justice. But the moment he took a sip of his freshly brewed coffee, he felt it, the weight of someone's gaze. Across the street, two women in matching tracksuits, each with a tiny dog on a leash, were staring at him, whispering to each other. Michael frowned. He had only just moved in, but he had already noticed the way his neighbors lingered their glances on him. He had a feeling he knew why. The fence. Even before moving in, Michael knew his property bordered a busy road. The original fence was far too low, only 4 feet tall. The problem? Passers-by could see directly into his backyard, and given that his face had appeared on the news more times than he cared to count, privacy wasn't just a luxury, it was a necessity. The solution? A new, taller fence. 8 feet, sturdy wood, perfectly matching the house's aesthetic, and, most importantly, 100% legal. Michael had done his homework. Not only had he checked state regulations, but he had also read the HOA bylaws cover to cover. Nowhere did it state that fences above a certain height were prohibited. He was absolutely certain he was in the right, but someone clearly disagreed. 2 days after the fence was completed, Michael found a white envelope on his porch. The seal was official, but the moment he saw the HOA logo, his instincts as a judge kicked in. Homeowners Association. Michael ripped the envelope open and skimmed the letter. Your fence is in violation of the community standards. We demand its immediate removal. Failure to comply will result in a fine of $500 per day. He clenched the letter in his fist. This was absurd. First, there were no actual standards in the HOA bylaws regulating fence height. Second, he had personally verified every possible restriction before starting construction. Third, the HOA had no legal authority to fine him for something that wasn't even a violation. Michael looked up and scanned the street. The two women with their dogs were still watching him. A man mowing his lawn quickly averted his gaze. So this wasn't a coincidence. Someone had complained. Someone had decided that he needed to play by their rules. And someone clearly had no idea who they were dealing with. A week passed. Michael had assumed the HOA would back off after realizing he wasn't an easy target. He was wrong. Exactly 7 days after the first letter, there was a knock at his door. Michael opened it to find a man in a suit carrying a leather briefcase and a rehearsed, polite smile. "Mr. Hudson?" Michael didn't move. "Who's asking?" "John Harris, HOA legal counsel. We have a court order for a hearing regarding your fence." He handed Michael the subpoena. Not a single muscle on Michael's face moved. They actually sued him. Slowly, he took the document and skimmed it. "You're seriously taking me to court over a perfectly legal fence?" Harris shrugged. "Nothing personal, sir. Our community values uniformity." Michael smirked. "And who filed the complaint?" The lawyer shook his head. "I can't disclose that information." Michael nodded slowly. "Fine. Then I'll find out in court." Without another word, He shut the door in the lawyer's face. The HOA had made a fatal mistake. They thought this was just another case of intimidation. They had no idea they had just sued a Supreme Court judge. The sky was heavy with gray clouds, and the air smelled of impending rain. Michael sat in a rocking chair on his porch, slowly stirring his coffee, savoring the calm before the storm. Tomorrow's hearing was already playing out in his mind. He was going to tear apart the HOA's ridiculous claims. But then he heard it. Heavy footsteps on the gravel path. Michael lifted his gaze. 4 people were approaching. Leading them was Marilyn Devereaux, a thin, sharp-featured woman in her 50s with a permanent scowl, short hair, and lips painted in a precise blood-red line. Behind her trailed 3 men, one carrying a folder, another holding a tablet, and the third standing stiffly, arms crossed like a bodyguard. Michael didn't move. He simply took a slow sip of his coffee, watching them approach. Marilyn didn't bother ringing the doorbell. Instead, she rapped her knuckles against the doorframe, the way an inspector might knock before searching a prison cell. "Judge, we need to talk." Her voice was cold and clipped, the voice of someone used to getting their way. Michael set his coffee down and rose to his feet. No rush. He adjusted his sleeves with deliberate ease, then met their gaze with quiet amusement. "About what exactly?" "Your fence," Marilyn said, eyes narrowing. "This is your last chance to handle this peacefully." Michael smirked. "Peacefully?" he echoed. "You call this peaceful? Threatening me with fines and lawsuits over a fence that's completely legal?" Marilyn crossed her arms. "It doesn't meet our community standards," she snapped. "The HOA has the right to enforce uniform aesthetics, and your fence disrupts the visual harmony of the neighborhood." Ah, there it was. Michael slowly nodded, feigning understanding. "So this isn't about legality. It's about control." Marilyn took a step forward. "Like it or not, HOA rules apply to everyone," she said, voice low. "If you don't take it down, we'll start fining you." Michael remained unfazed. "How much?" The man with the folder flipped a page and cleared his throat. $500 per day. Michael nearly laughed, the sheer audacity of it all. But when he looked at Marilyn's smug expression as if she truly believed she could bully him into submission, something inside him coiled tight. "Did you even bother to check who you're dealing with?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. Marilyn narrowed her eyes. "You're just another homeowner, and HOA laws apply to everyone." Michael stepped forward, tilting his head slightly. "Wrong, Ms. Devereaux. I'm not just another homeowner." He let the words sink in. Then, with a slow, deliberate smirk, he finished. "I'm a Supreme Court judge." A beat of silence. The 3 men exchanged uneasy glances. For a split second, Marilyn's face faltered, but she quickly recovered, her lips tightening. "See you in court, Judge," she said through gritted teeth, before spinning on her heel. Her entourage followed in stiff silence. Michael watched them go, fingers curling into a fist. They thought they could intimidate me? Big mistake. The next morning, Michael stepped onto his porch with a cup of coffee and immediately noticed a crowd gathered in front of his house. They weren't hostile, but their eyes held a mix of unease, curiosity, and a flicker of hidden hope. Some shifted from foot to foot. Others whispered among themselves, glancing up at his towering fence. It was clear. The HOA had ruled this neighborhood with fear for years. And now, the idea that someone dared to stand up to them. Unbelievable. From the crowd, an older man, probably in his 60s, wearing a worn cowboy shirt and faded jeans, stepped forward. He had lived here long enough to know exactly what the HOA was capable of. "You're really taking them on?" he asked, crossing his arms. Michael took a slow sip of coffee, met his gaze, and replied, "I'm not just taking them on. I'm going to destroy them." A hush fell over the crowd. Someone let out a surprised breath. Someone smirked. Someone else glanced around nervously, as if afraid the HOA was listening. But they wouldn't have to wait long, because just minutes later, the HOA came to them. A black SUV with tinted windows pulled up to the curb. Two men in sharp suits stepped out, leather folders in hand, their movements slow, calculated. Michael wasn't surprised. They weren't waiting for court. They were here to pressure him now. One of them, a tall, balding man with an oily smirk, stepped forward and unfolded a document. "Mr. Hudson," he said, his voice dripping with premature victory, "you are officially fined $10,000 for refusing to remove your fence." The crowd murmured in shock. A few gasped. Others clenched their fists. But Michael? He simply set his coffee cup on the porch railing and, with deliberate ease, reached into his pocket, pulled out his own folder, and, without hesitation, said, "And you are officially out of your damn minds." He held up his own lawsuit. Charges against the HOA, unlawful abuse of authority, illegal fines, intimidation of homeowners. One of the lawyers adjusted his glasses nervously. The other frowned, suddenly realizing this wasn't going as planned. This is a joke, right?" One of them finally stammered. Michael's eyes locked onto theirs, and with a slow, predatory smirk, he replied, "See you in court." The murmurs in the crowd shifted. For the first time, people saw it. The HOA wasn't invincible. The suited men exchanged silent, uneasy glances. Michael saw disappointment flash in their eyes. They had come to intimidate him. Instead, they had declared war. And tomorrow, they would learn just how badly they had screwed up. A week passed. A week of absolute silence from the HOA. No more threats, no more letters, no more official statements. The neighbors noticed it too. No new rules appeared on the community bulletin boards. No one received fines for fence colors or overgrown grass. The HOA had gone completely still. But Michael knew better. This wasn't the end. Sitting on his porch, sipping his coffee, he heard it again. The heavy footsteps. Slowly, he lifted his gaze. The same delegation. The same 3 men in suits. But this time, their posture had changed. Tense shoulders, avoided eye contact. Gone was their usual arrogance. And at the front, Marilyn Devereaux. But she was no longer the haughty woman who had sneered at him a week ago. Now she looked like someone who knew she had lost. She stopped at the base of the porch, hesitating, as if bracing herself. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was hoarse, stripped of its usual authority. "We have decided to drop the fines." Michael set his cup down and folded his arms. "And?" Marilyn's jaw tightened. It was clear. Saying these words was killing her. "We will no longer interfere with your fence." A heavy silence. For a moment, everything was still. But Michael wasn't done. "Too late." Marilyn's head snapped up. "I won the case," Michael said simply. "And now the HOA is required to pay $250,000 in penalties for illegal fees imposed on homeowners." The crowd exploded. People gasped, whispered. Some laughed in disbelief. For years they had suffered under this HOA. For absurd violations. For fines over trash cans placed on the curb at the wrong time. For being told what color they could paint their own doors. But now, for the first time, the HOA was on its knees. "You can't do this!" Marilyn snapped, her face twisting with rage. Michael smiled. "I already did." Her fists clenched. That arrogant expression flickered back, but now it looked pathetic. She spun on her heel, storming away. Her entourage hurried after her, and as they disappeared down the street, the neighbors erupted. Some clapped. Some patted Michael on the back. Some simply nodded with newfound respect. But a week later, something happened that even Michael didn't expect. Several neighbors built fences even taller than his, and just like that, the HOA's reign of fear was over. While some spent the following weeks grieving their lost control, Michael Hudson sat on his porch drinking his coffee and enjoying the peace he had fought for.